to our next module, which is on emotional and social being, or the study of social psychology. We just got done with doing our developmental psychology section, and I hope you enjoyed reading about how we change over time. And for some of us who are getting a little bit older, I hope it gave you something to look forward to, that we just don't stagnate eventually and just stop developing. But I also hope for any of our future parents or parents in the class that it gave some information that you might find helpful and the like. But we're going to start on the social world and how it influences who we are as individuals and our individual psychology. And really, there's a lot to talk about in this section. If you'll notice, this section actually doesn't end until mid-November, even though it's starting about mid-October now. I know we're a couple days behind, but I apologize about that. But we'll get you caught up. So I just want to kind of go over the section so that you kind of know what to expect and what's to come, and then we will go over what you should be working on and where we should be heading. You will notice that this section we have, I believe, 4 check for learning quizzes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right now there's only, I've got to finish this one up. I'll probably have it done in the next day or two. 1 put discussion post, but there'll probably be a total of 3 discussion posts when we're all done and going. But don't worry about the discussion posts right at this point. What I want you to worry about is this first section and this first quiz area. But I kind of want to go through the lessons and everything to kind of show you kind of a preview of what to expect and how to work through each of these sections. So you'll note, so if we start here with the humans, our first is social and feeling human being, we'll start with this module. Now, this is quite a lengthy module. It has just a few audio and visual medias, but most of it is actually reading. And so we have an introduction to what is social psychology, which will give a definition, give the 3 general themes, and then we're going to have a long conversation about identity and loneliness and social belonging, because this is a very important concept right now in the area of social psychology, and actually our understanding of what makes us human overall. And so this is a very important topic. If there's one topic that you need to have in this class, I think this is the one that I encourage you to spend some time with. So we'll start with identity and loneliness. We're going to start with some terminology so that we're all on the same page and using these terms in the same way through this class. And then we'll talk about the self-concept, self-awareness, and self-esteem. We talk about feelings, emotions, and gut reactions. We'll talk about the 3 forms of identity: social identity, personal identity, and cultural identity, and how those influence behavior and how they influence how we act and behave in certain situations. We'll talk about social belonging and what makes human beings such social beings. We'll find out that we're biologically wired to need each other, and we're psychologically wired to need. And I'm not going to say need, it's a drive to be with each other, and it's really the basis of our survival if we were to put it in evolutionary terms. And then we will go through, and you can see there's quite a bit. We'll talk about the psychological mechanisms that why we seek out belonging, for understanding, control, self-enhancement, and trust. And then we'll talk about the mechanism that tries to make sure we stay socially connected, which is loneliness. And some of the positive and negative. I said in the developmental section we'll have a lot longer discussion on this topic, and I'm keeping my word. We'll start with the historical development, and then we will end with discussing the theoretical elements of loneliness. And then we'll talk about how that thwarts belonging. This will get into a discussion on emotions. Now I'm using loneliness as a springboard to have the longer discussion about emotions and emotional states. I'm just using loneliness as the example, but it's also part of this theoretical foundation that we're going to try and apply. And then we're going to use social identity theory as a theory that shows why it's important to stay connected. And then we're going to conclude with why should we stop focusing so much on just the individual. And we will see right here, there's a whole lot of reasons why we should do that. After that, so this is my recommendation. Before you do this section, look at the Check for Learning 11. You're able to take it multiple times, but look at the Check of Learning and see what the essay questions are so that you know when you're reading through this kind of what you're looking for in the development of your essay answers. I believe there's about 5 essay questions in this Check for Learning. Okay? This is the one thing I want you to focus on right now for this first week or so, so keep that in mind. And then as we progress, note that there's due dates before November 15th for each of these sections to kind of keep you, so you're not waiting till the last moment. There are certain due dates for each of these things. I think this one's due in a week or two. So instead of the November 15th, so keep that in mind. The next thing that we're going to talk about after we're done talking about the importance of social belonging, loneliness, and identity is we're going to go into gender and intimate relationships, which is one of our more important identities that we have. And as you can see, this is still under construction, but what we need to talk about is one, what is a scientific definition of gender? Because it's not a binary definition that we see in popular culture, such as male, female, and the like. In science, we see gender as a continuum. We also see sexual identity as a continuum, and we'll go over those. This will lead us into a conversation about intimate relationships. Yes, the majority of relationships are heterosexual for reproductive purposes, but that, as we'll see, even with human sexuality, sex isn't always the goal of sex is not always reproduction, just like the goal of intimate relationships is not always about building a family that includes biological children. And that's something important to talk about as we talk about what is intimacy as it's defined by your sexual identity and your gender identity, and really what is the human experience when it comes to those issues. So we need to define what is intimacy, what is an intimate relationship, what is attraction, and the like, and this is what this section is all about. You'll notice that intimacy and intimate relationships is differentiated from our human sexuality section. In the beginning of the course, I think it was a biological section, I noted that the human brain separates the two. Human intimacy with human sexuality are two separate neural tracts, one running along the left, one running along the right, in the spheres of the brain. And they truly are two different aspects of a human being. Now, intimacy drive us to, yes, reproduce with a few individuals. Sexual drives try to drive us to reproduce with several individuals. This is true. There are gender differences in this. But what we want to talk about in this section is what are the general trends of human sexuality? Why is this being discussed in a psychology class instead of a biology class? And I'm going to give you the hint right now. If sex was all about just reproduction, you would expect that the ratio of sex to impregnation and live birth would be very close. It would be almost a 1-to-1 ratio. But for human beings, don't go test this and then blame me. But for human beings, we only have one live birth for every 1,000 times we have sex, and that's controlling for things like abortion. Okay, so don't blame abortion on that number. Every 1,000 times we have sex, we impregnate and we have a birth. And so sexuality is more than just reproduction. And so we need to talk about this in the context of the human psychology and the human mechanisms that drive sexuality. And we'll find that it's more of a bonding mechanism than it is a reproduction mechanism. Then we're going to talk about social cognition. I've mentioned this many times, and I mentioned this in the beginning of this, that much of our life is spent talking about us, thinking about us and us acting within a social situation. And this can't be underestimated, but there are certain thinking errors that we can make in our interpretation of human behaviors when we're thinking about people. And so we're going to talk about social cognition, and this is really the way we think about our social world. And we'll talk about different ways that, yes, we can make mistakes, but a lot of times these heuristics and ways we think about our world kind of got us to where we're at, so they're kind of working for us. But we do need to talk about when they don't work for us, because that's the most important. Much of social psychology was spent looking at things like social obedience, compliance, and conformity, which we will get into. You know, one of the biggest issues that I've dealt with in my career is this issue that people who are violent are mentally ill. And the truth is that most people who are violent don't even have a symptom of mental illness. Indeed, it's the situation that a person finds themselves in, and the situational variables that better predict violence within a society than it does mental illness or personality traits of the individual. But we'll get to that when we get to this section. And then, of course, we can't talk about human conditions. We're talking about belonging and needing each other. We also have this need to differentiate from people who are not like us, and to make sure our group is seen as better than or different from another group. And unfortunately, this can come out in very prejudiced and discriminatory ways, especially when we feel our group has a fragile or need for power basis. And so we're going to talk about things like prejudice and discrimination and how it shapes our own experiences. And we'll discuss this idea, is there anybody who is really not prejudiced? And I think we'll have an interesting discussion about this. The last section that we'll talk about in this area is environmental psychology. This is a relatively new area of study in the field of psychology. It's very interdisciplinary. But we'll look at how or if human behavior can actually change in response to environmental problems. And so we'll take a closer look at that, and that's how we'll wrap up this section. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I'm here for your learning and look forward to interacting and talking with each one of you. And we will see you on